Around 9 out of every 10 people on Earth use the same hand to write, throw, and eat. The other 1 in 10 does everything in reverse. That split has been stable for at least 10,000 years, maybe longer. And for most of that time, nobody had a convincing explanation for why it existed at all. The question sounds simple. It isn't. Handedness turns out to be one of the stranger puzzles in human biology, because the answer keeps pointing somewhere deeper than anyone expected. Not just to genes, not just to culture, but all the way down to the very first weeks of life inside the womb, before a single nerve has finished forming. Start with the brain. The clearest thing science can say about handedness is that it isn't really about the hand at all. It's about which side of the brain is running the show. In most right-handed people, the left hemisphere controls language and fine motor movement. The right hand is an extension of that dominance. In left-handed people, the arrangement is less predictable. Some mirror it exactly. Others show a more mixed or distributed pattern, with both hemispheres sharing more of the work. The fundamental rule is that hand control crosses sides. Your right hand is managed by your left brain. Your left hand is managed by your right brain. That crossover is not an accident. It's baked into the architecture of the nervous system. But knowing which side is dominant doesn't explain why one side becomes dominant in the first place. That's where the biology gets strange. Researchers have known for decades that handedness runs in families, but not cleanly. 2 left-handed parents produce mostly right-handed children. Identical twins share every gene and still frequently end up with opposite hand preferences. Twin studies suggest that genetics accounts for roughly 1/4 of handedness. The other 3/4 come from somewhere else. Part of it appears to be random. Fluctuations in the chemical environment of the early developing brain, small asymmetries in the way neurons wire themselves up, tiny differences in the timing of cell division. None of those things are determined by DNA. They just happen, quietly, in the first few weeks after conception, before the pregnancy is even confirmed. But genes aren't absent from the picture. In 2023, a study published in Nature Communications examined the genetic data of more than 350,000 people and found something specific. A gene called TUBB4B showed rare variants that appeared far more often in left-handed individuals than in right-handed ones. TUBB4B is involved in building microtubules, the structural scaffolding inside cells. Microtubules support cilia, which are tiny hair-like structures that push fluid around the developing embryo. That fluid flow is not symmetric. It moves in a particular direction, and that directional push appears to nudge the developing organs into their asymmetric positions. The heart goes left. The liver goes right. And somewhere in that same early cascade, the brain begins to organize itself along a semi-lar axis. The same gene implicated in handedness is also linked to which side of your body your heart sits on. That connection is not a coincidence. It's a glimpse of something much older than human beings. Another gene called NME7 works along a similar pathway. It affects the left-right placement of the visceral organs during embryonic development, and it also shows up in research on brain lateralization. The picture that emerges is not of a single handedness gene flipping a switch. It's of a broad developmental system, one that sets the basic asymmetry of the body itself, and handedness emerges as a downstream consequence of how that system unfolds in any given person. Most of the time, the result is right-handedness. Sometimes it isn't. And the gap between those two outcomes is only partially written in the genome. Here is the part that keeps getting underweighted. Culture does something to these numbers. The proportion of left-handers varies measurably between countries in ways that genetics alone cannot explain. Studies comparing populations across different nations found that rates of left-handedness were significantly higher in places where cultural pressure to switch was lower. In societies where left-handed children were actively corrected, sometimes harshly, the prevalence dropped. China historically showed left-handedness rates below 4%, a figure most researchers attribute to intense social pressure rather than anything biological. The Latin word for left is sinister. The word for right is dexter. Those word choices were not neutral. Throughout medieval Europe, left-handedness was treated as a mark of suspicion associated with the devil and with moral defect. Children were switched. Adults were watched. The hand someone used to write with was considered a statement about their character. That kind of pressure, applied across enough generations, changes a population's apparent distribution without touching a single gene. Sex also matters. Males are consistently more likely to be left-handed than females, across nearly every dataset that has looked at the question. In large U.S. samples, roughly 12 to 13% of men are left-handed, compared to around 10% of women. The reason isn't settled. Some researchers point to testosterone levels during fetal development. Others point to the same brain asymmetry mechanisms that produce lateralization differences across the sexes more broadly. Birth weight, season of birth, whether a child was breastfed, and whether they were part of a multiple birth have all been shown to have small but measurable effects on which hand a person ends up preferring. Each of those factors is operating on the same underlying developmental system, pushing it slightly one direction or another during a window that closes early. What makes left-handed people neurologically distinct is not just the reversal, it's the variability. Because left-handed brains are organized more loosely, with less rigid lateralization, there tends to be more active communication between the two hemispheres. The corpus callosum, the thick band of fibers connecting left and right, can show higher connectivity in left-handed individuals. Some researchers have linked that to advantages in certain types of spatial reasoning and creative tasks. But the evidence is mixed, and the effect sizes are modest. What's clearer is that left-handedness represents not a defect in the system, but a different stable outcome, one that the same developmental process can produce when the early conditions tip a different way. The system that builds a right-handed brain and the system that builds a left-handed brain are the same system. It just landed differently, somewhere around day 20 of an embryo's life, in a fluid-filled space where the cilia were pushing in one direction, and the whole long story of how someone would hold a pen was already beginning to be decided.